The morning air hung sharp and cold over Ridge Base, carrying that desert chill that slipped under collar seams and settled in your bones. Sergeant Rebecca Reese Martinez had been stationed here for 8 months now, arriving without fanfare like she always did. Her boots moved quietly over the pitted gravel as she crossed to the edge of Training Pad 2, where another group of sniper trainees were already setting up their equipment. Metal crates clanked open as scopes were lifted, checked, and mounted. Someone called out a wind check from the east quarter. Another voice responded with a correction. Too wide, too fast. Reese said nothing. They weren't talking to her anyway. "Hey, Cloud Counter's here," said Tyler Brennan, a tall trainee with an easy grin that came too often. He nodded toward Reese without really looking at her, speaking to his buddy Jake Morrison. "Maybe she'll track butterflies for us too." Morrison laughed, not loud, but enough. The kind of laugh that said they all shared the same joke about her. Reese didn't acknowledge them. She stepped to the outer marker, unpacked her range pad, and placed it flat across a weathered folding board. Her hands moved with muscle memory smooth, no wasted movement. She unrolled a laminated drift chart from her side pouch, its surface creased and soft at the edges from hundreds of uses. Her vest was marked with one black-inked word stitched across the back panel. Observer. No rank stripe, no division patch. Just the assignment that had been handed to her and never updated. It wasn't wrong, but it wasn't complete either. The truth was, Reese had been one of the best marksmen in her unit before they transferred her here. 3 confirmed kills in Afghanistan. Expert marksman rating, decorated twice for precision under pressure. But that was before the incident with Major Bradley, before she'd questioned his orders, during a mission that nearly got 6 soldiers killed, before he'd made sure her file was flagged with attitude problems and difficulty following chain of command. Now she was stuck counting wind patterns at a training base in Nevada, watching kids who couldn't hit a barn door learn to be snipers while her own rifle gathered dust in the armory. She reached for her grease pencil red, wrapped in tape near the center because she liked the grip that way. The tip had worn flat from constant use, never sharpened to a blade, but pressed often and deliberately. She used it like a surgeon would use a scalpel. Her eyes moved to the first wind flag 300 meters out, fluttering against the slope of the western rise. She watched the tip of the flag, not its body. The difference mattered. Then she shifted her gaze to the thermal shimmer lifting over the sand, gauging the current rise rate against horizon drag. She recorded her first mark, wind bearing 2 above forecast, surface roll at 1.3 meters per second. She boxed the numbers without commentary. Across the line, instructors adjusted spotting scopes. Orders were traded across clipped headset mics. Reese wasn't on their channel. She didn't need to be. A communications officer had offered to patch her into the main feed 3 weeks ago. She'd declined. There was nothing in their chatter she hadn't heard before. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was probably the most qualified person on this entire range, and they had her measuring wind speed like some glorified weather station. "We're live in 2 minutes," called out Instructor Davis, his voice carrying across the range. Last call for spotter data. A few notes rang out in response, quick calls of wind rate and field pressure. None of them aligned with what Reese was seeing. She stayed silent. Her data was already written, boxed, and exact. The first shot cracked across the pad. Not clean. Reese tracked the drift a full half-second before the echo, noted the drop, and penciled in a correction that wouldn't be read. A pair of trainees to her right muttered something about scope shake. Another adjusted his jacket collar, like it was the jacket's fault. Reese kept writing as the drills continued. She shifted her focus between flag drift and thermals, annotating wind loops and noting break patterns near the southern ridge wall. No one glanced her way. No one crossed the line to ask what she was seeing. They never did. Still, she stayed until her field log held exactly 100 minutes of data. That was her rhythm, personal, unspoken, consistent. At the end of that mark, she folded her drift chart cleanly, aligned the pencil along its spine, and slipped both into her side pouch. As she turned toward the equipment rack, the bass loudspeaker crackled overhead with a dry buzz. Sandstorm watch active. 30% chance. Standby. A few of the instructors looked up. One of them cursed under his breath. Brennan muttered something about getting their gear out early. Reese stood still, listening to the wind. She looked once toward the ridgeline, then down at her vest, at the name they had stitched without asking her preference. Observer. Her fingers brushed the edge of the grease pencil through the pouch. She didn't take it out again. There was nothing left to mark. For now, she adjusted the strap across her shoulder and turned back toward the outpost. The morning drills would continue. So would the silence. She expected nothing else. But deep down, Reese knew something was building. She could feel it in the way the wind patterns were shifting, in the way certain frequencies kept getting dismissed by command, in the way her reports were filed but never acted upon. Something was coming to Ridge Base, and when it did, they were going to need more than a weather observer. They were going to need a soldier. By midday, the heat had changed. It didn't rise in waves now. It shimmered tight and flat over the ridge line like a pane of glass. The wind flags still moved, but they drooped slightly at the tips, registering only surface gusts that didn't match the pressure Reese felt building in her jaw and behind her ears. The crosswind had shifted sometime after 1,000 hours, just enough to affect low-angle drag, but not enough for the sensor log to blink yellow. Reese noted it anyway. She logged the shift manually, angled her scope lower, and adjusted the pressure lines on her chart. The recon post sat just northeast of the tower complex, tucked behind a stack of signal cases and one portable shade rig that didn't do much except block her view of the supply routes. From this angle, the entire valley spread out before her. In a wide arc scrub clusters, flattened grass, and a dry creek channel that cut diagonally across the lower third. It was known for swirl drift and shadow pooling. That was part of why she'd been assigned here. Not to watch targets, to watch the wind. Her tools were minimal. A laminated field map folded in thirds, a range scope adjusted for glare, and the same tape-wrapped grease pencil she'd used that morning. The ridge cast no real shadow now. The sun was too high, the heat too direct. Still, she could feel a wrongness forming in the distance. Not something she could name at first, just a shape. In the landscape that didn't repeat. She checked the exercise sheet again, just to be sure. The sniper qualification cycle was in Phase 3, moving targets across the southeast field zone. None of the scheduled silhouettes were placed beyond Marker 5. What she was watching was near Marker 8, and it was moving. Reese leaned into the scope, recentered, and counted. 4 shapes, all low to the ground. The pacing was too tight for trainees, too methodical. No separation gaps, no jitter from radio communications. Just steady forward motion, quartered across terrain in a line that didn't match any pre-brief scenario. The wind at this range was deceptive. It flattened sound. She could see the grass lean backward in slow waves, but heard nothing. No crunch. No scrape. No wind shear against packs or boots. Just movement. Consistent. Unbroken. She double-checked her compass readout, then drew a small arc on her paper map, a contour that tracked their motion against the slope angle. Her pencil made a faint grit sound against the page. She boxed the mark, adjusted for estimated drift, and clicked her radio once. Observer Post 4, reporting unscheduled movement, northwest quadrant of Zone 7, bearing 182. Confirm no friendly units in that sector. Over. There was a pause. Not long, just enough for background noise to rise. Then the channel crackled with a voice she knew, Lieutenant Kendra Mallory, clipped and confident. Post 4. This is Tower. Wind distortion may be generating false signatures. No assets operating in that band. Recommend visual reset. Over. Reese didn't blink. She adjusted her scope by 1 degree and watched the line move again. This time she was sure. There were 4 figures, crouched, smooth, advancing just beyond the hollow in the far scrub. She tapped the map again and read through the arc. Thicker this time. Her pencil left a smudge near the bottom edge. Tower, visual. Confirms pattern movement inconsistent with scheduled drills. Recommend recheck of Zone 8 boundaries. Thermal pattern does not match mirage drift. Over. This time, the voice came back sharper. Observer, we show full green on external teams. Zone 7 is cleared for exercise. No friendly units unaccounted. You may be picking up terrain echo. Maintain your post. Tower out. No follow-up, no queries. Just done. Across the private channel, someone else muttered with a grin in their voice. Mirage fever gets them every year when the rocks start breathing. The comment wasn't directed at her. It didn't need to be. Reese sat back slightly, not enough to break line of sight, and looked at the figures again. They hadn't stopped. If anything, they had increased pace, moving now in slight diagonals. She could see the lead shape shift behind a low mound, then reappear 2 meters forward. Too clean for random drift. She opened her map fully on the flat, tray in front of her, and began redrawing the boundary lines. She circled the terrain funnel she had noted earlier, the slope that carried sound downward but diffused visual contrast. Then she drew a new symbol, an irregular spiral with a bar through the middle. It wasn't part of any issued protocol. It was hers. She had used it 3 times before, on 3 other bases, when drift patterns turned from irregular to calculated. No one else knew what it meant. That was the point. The wind rolled past again, low and slow. One of the forward flags twisted just enough to confirm the crossdraft was still active. Reese reached for her pencil and drew one final mark-projected trajectory, barely visible across the map's lower edge. She pressed a little harder than she needed to. The graphite broke slightly at the tip. She looked at the scope again, then to the valley and back to the line on her page. She did not call tower again. There was no use. Instead, she stared at the unauthorized symbol she had drawn, the one shaped like a warning whispered without sound. Her fingers hovered just above the page. She didn't erase it. She didn't mark it as a note. She just left it there, watching and waiting like her. But now she was certain. This wasn't mirage fever or wind distortion. Someone was probing Ridge Base's perimeter, testing their blind spots, mapping their response times. And command was too arrogant to listen to the one person actually watching. By late afternoon, the light had shifted again. It no longer flared against the gravel or danced over the scope lens. It had gone flat. The kind of dim clarity that made everything look just a little too still. Reese adjusted her position slightly to stay within the shadow cast by the tower's outer rigging. The heat was no longer unbearable, but it had left behind a weight in the air, thick with dust and silence. Her headset fed her a slow drip of routine updates. Tower calling wind adjustments for range 6. One trainee requesting resupply coordinates, a correction on calibration from zone 3. None of it mattered. Not now. The valley stretched out quiet. In front of her, and the motion she'd tracked all morning had returned. This time, she didn't need the scope. They were moving again, not drifting, not pacing like a patrol. Moving with intent. Organized and tight. 5 figures now, spread into 2 staggered groups, crossing the far edge of Zone 8, just outside what the base had mapped as secure boundary. There were no scheduled friendlies in that zone. Reese had already checked 3 times. Her chart sat, folded beside her boot, untouched since she'd marked it earlier. Her scope confirmed the motion without ambiguity. The pattern of approach was unmistakable. Then, the base system chimed a clipped, mechanical tone through the headset. Motion alert, outer perimeter. Low confidence index. Reese keyed her mic. Tower, this is post 4. Motion confirmed. 5 figures. Quadrant north by northwest. Outside exercise boundary. Bearing 203. Repeat. Confirmed sighting. Visual non-compliant with base pathing. Awaiting instruction. A pause. Then a voice familiar, curt. Post 4. Tower here. That sensor has a false positive history. You are advised to maintain your post. Teams are in position. All drills still active. No escalation. Another pause. Static. Then a second voice cut across the main channel. Tower. This is Field Command 1. Shooter's Outmatix is pinned in the low range behind elevation shift. Trainee Rodriguez lost line of sight during last fire cycle. Trying to reassign sector. Reese didn't speak. She already knew the tower had lost its flank coverage. The breach wasn't theoretical. It wasn't flagged by some long-range predictive system or picked up by drone echo. It was walking right in. Now, through an unguarded slope that command didn't even have eyes on, except hers. She reached for the chart once more, confirming her hand-drawn arc. The wind had pulled slightly east enough to change her earlier. Drift line by 2 degrees. It was still within a predictable range, but not for anyone else. Only someone who had been watching the patterns hour by hour could make that call without waiting for a readout. She looked down the ridge behind her. No one was coming. Not to her post, not to the rifle someone had left leaning against the sandbag wall. It had been sitting there since the trainee had jogged off after reporting a fogged scope and overheating thermal wrap. Reese hadn't moved it. It wasn't hers. But now it was the only thing that could make a difference. The figures were closer. Now close enough that she could make out individual movement patterns. Professional. Coordinated. Definitely not friendlies running a drill. Her radio crackled again. All units, maintain current positions. We're getting conflicting sensor data. Stand by for system reset. A system reset. While hostiles were literally walking into the perimeter. That's when Reese realized the truth. It wasn't incompetence. It wasn't just arrogance. Someone in command wanted the system to fail. Someone was deliberately ignoring her reports, dismissing the alerts, keeping the shooters out of position. This wasn't bureaucratic stupidity. This was sabotage from the inside. Her blood went cold. She thought about Major Bradley, about how he'd made sure she ended up here, isolated and ignored. About Lieutenant Mallory's 2 quick dismissals. About how every report she'd filed had been buried or discredited. They hadn't just sidelined her to shut her up. They'd put her here because they needed someone to blame when things went wrong. The observer who cried wolf. The troubled soldier. With the attitude problems, who saw threats that weren't there. Except the threats were real. And now she was the only thing standing between them and whatever they were planning to hit. She stepped over to the rifle slow, careful, as if walking, into something sacred. Her hands didn't shake as she lifted it. Her posture shifted, not dramatically, just enough to mark the difference. She was no longer observing, she was aligning. The rifle was clean, well-oiled, heavy in a way that settled against her like it. Knew her shape. She checked the chamber loaded, safety on. She flipped it off. Her finger did not rest on the trigger yet. She had done this before. Not here, not for them, but somewhere, long ago, under skies that had carried a different kind of silence. She sank to one knee, adjusted the sling pressure, and lowered her cheek to the stock. Her breath was measured in through the nose, out slowly through the mouth. 1 count, 2. eyes open, crosswind steady. She adjusted the sight by a quarter mark, compensating for the lift loss against the sloped valley pressure. The first figure crested the rise, too clean, too upright, not part of any drill. Her hand moved to stabilize her base. The second figure moved next, slightly behind, staggered just right. Reese didn't wait for the third. Her breath slowed. One shot. No echo. No collapse. Just one form dropping out of motion. The others halted. The stillness after was deep, no sound from her headset, no return fire, no sudden alert from the tower. Just stillness. The breach had ended. Not with noise, not with light, but with a pause so profound it made the wind sound louder than it was. But as Reese lowered the rifle and exhaled, she knew this was just the beginning. Someone in command had wanted this attack to succeed, and now they'd have to explain why their unreliable observer had been the only one positioned to stop it. The real fight was about to begin. The silence after the shot was not immediate. It arrived in layers. First, the hush in her headset. 3 full seconds of pure nothing. No static, no breath, no click of acknowledgement. Then the world around her seemed to lean back, as if the air itself was registering that something final had occurred. The wind barely moved. The flag at her post, which had been fluttering unevenly all day, now hung with its tip bent downward, weighted by stillness. Then the voices returned, sharp and confused. Tower to all units. Confirm status. Range teams. Check in. Who engaged? Repeat. Who fired? Another voice cut in, sharper. We have unknown engagement from perimeter east. No ID on source. Confirm all shooters in hold. Can anyone verify shot origin? More chatter followed names. Sector numbers, range statuses. Some clipped, some confused. No one claimed it. No one even knew where to point. The entire system hesitated in its own echo. Reese stayed exactly where she was for one full breath, then another. She looked through the scope again, not to verify a hit, but to read the drift. It had already shifted by a fraction, almost unnoticeable unless you'd been charting it every hour. She noted it automatically, a habit long drilled into her hands. Then she did something that would change everything. She reached into her vest pocket and pulled out a small digital recorder standard issue for range observers, used to log weather conditions and equipment malfunctions. She'd been running it all day, capturing every radio exchange, every dismissed report, every moment when command had ignored her warnings. She stopped the recording, ejected the memory card, and slipped it into a small waterproof case. Then she started a new recording and began speaking in a calm, clear voice. This is Sergeant Rebecca Martinez, Observer Post 4, Ridge Base, Nevada. Time is 15:47 hours, June 20th. I am documenting a security breach that resulted in engagement of hostile forces attempting to infiltrate the base perimeter. She paused, watching as figures began moving across the valley, finally responding to her shot, but too late. At approximately 1200 hours, I observed and reported unauthorized movement in Zone 8. My reports were dismissed by Tower Command as false positives. At 1535 hours, I confirmed 5 hostile figures advancing on the base through an unguarded approach route. When Tower Command failed to respond to repeated warnings, I took defensive action using an abandoned training rifle. She looked toward the tower, where she could see figures moving behind the windows, suddenly very interested in her position. I am preserving this recording and related documentation as evidence of systemic failure in base security protocols and possible deliberate negligence by command staff. She clicked off the recorder and slipped it into her cargo pocket, then stood and stepped back from the rifle. She didn't try to hide what she'd done. Instead, she made sure her actions were visible and deliberate. Within minutes, she heard the approach of boots on gravel. Heavy, purposeful strides, not the uncertain shuffle of trainees, but the determined march of senior personnel who suddenly had questions that needed answers. Sergeant First Class William Torres appeared first, followed by Lieutenant Mallory, and two MPs. Torres was old-school military, grizzled, fair, and known for caring more about results than politics. Mallory looked pale, her earlier confidence replaced by something that looked suspiciously like panic. "Martinez," Torres said, his voice carefully neutral. "Step away from the weapon." Reese complied immediately, raising her hands slightly to show they were empty. "Sergeant First Class, the rifle is safe. Chamber clear. Safety engaged." Torres approached the rifle while one of the MPs positioned himself behind Reese. Not threatening, just protocol. Mallory hung back, speaking rapidly into her radio in hushed tones. "Walk me through what happened here," Torres said, examining the rifle and the position. His eyes took in the meticulous setup, the wind charts, the careful documentation spread across her workstation. "I observed and reported hostile movement in Zone 8 beginning at 1200 hours, Reese said evenly. "Multiple reports to Tower Command. Were dismissed. When 5 figures breached the perimeter and Tower failed to respond, I engaged the threat." "You engaged without authorization," Mallory interrupted, approaching with her radio still in hand. "You fired without clearance, without confirmation, without—" "Lieutenant," Torres cut her off quietly, but his tone carried weight. "Let her finish." Reese met Torres's eyes. "Sergeant First Class, I have detailed documentation of all observations, radio communications, and weather conditions. I also have recordings of dismissed warnings and failed response protocols." Something flickered. In Torres's expression, interest, maybe even respect. He'd been in combat. He knew the difference between someone covering their ass and someone who genuinely prevented a disaster. "Where's this documentation?" he asked. Reese gestured to her workstation. "Wind charts, observation logs, and digital recordings. All. Standard protocol for range observers. I can provide copies." Torres walked over to examine her charts. Even from a distance, Reese could see his expression change as he took in the meticulous detail, the precise markings, the professional quality of her work. "This is comprehensive," he said, almost to himself. Then, louder, "Martinez, you're coming with us. Bring everything." As they prepared to escort her back to base, Reese caught sight of movement near the impact site. A recovery team was already heading out to investigate what or who she'd hit. Within the hour, they'd have confirmation that her target had been carrying equipment that didn't belong to any U.S. training exercise. Lieutenant Mallory was still speaking urgently into her radio, but now she kept glancing at Reese with an expression that had moved well past panic into something approaching fear. Because they both knew what the evidence would show. Reese had been right about everything. The threat was real, her warnings were accurate, and command had failed catastrophically. But more than that, someone in command had wanted to fail, and now Reese had the documentation to prove it. As they walked toward the command building, Torres fell into step beside her. "Martinez," he said quietly, "I'm going to ask you straight. Do you think this was incompetence or something else?" Reese considered her words carefully. "Sergeant First Class, I think the evidence will speak for itself." He nodded grimly. "That's what I was afraid of." The real investigation was about to begin. The debriefing room in the command building was smaller than Reese had expected, just 4 metal chairs around a scratched table, fluorescent lights that flickered every few seconds, and a digital recorder sitting in the center like a silent judge. Sergeant First Class Torres sat across from her, a thick folder already open in front of him. Lieutenant Mallory was conspicuously absent, dealing with the recovery operation. Torres had said, but his tone suggested she was dealing with something else entirely. Captain James Mitchell had joined them base security chief, a man with sharp eyes and the kind of stillness that came from years of asking hard questions. He'd been reviewing Reese's documentation for the past hour while she waited. "Sergeant Martinez," Captain Mitchell began, his voice measured. "Let's start with the timeline. Your first observation was at 1200 hours?" "Yes, sir. I logged unscheduled movement in Zone 8 and reported it immediately to Tower Command." "And the response?" "Lieutenant Mallory dismissed it as wind distortion and false signatures. She advised a visual reset and ordered me to maintain position." Torres leaned forward. "But you didn't just drop it." "No, Sergeant First Class. I continued monitoring and documented additional movement patterns that were inconsistent with environmental factors or scheduled exercises." Captain Mitchell tapped a page in the folder. "Your wind charts show remarkable detail. This level of documentation, is this standard for observer positions?" Reese hesitated. The truth was, her charts were far more detailed than required. She'd been using her downtime to create the most comprehensive environmental maps the base had ever seen, partly from boredom, partly from a professional pride that wouldn't quit. "I maintain thorough records, sir. The desert environment here creates complex wind patterns that affect range accuracy. I believe detailed documentation would be valuable for training purposes." "Valuable enough that someone copied them," Torres said, sliding a paper across the table. "We found copies of your charts in the armory prep room. Someone had been using your data to improve the modeling software." Reese stared at the copied chart. "Someone had been taking her work, using it, improving base systems with it all, while keeping her isolated and dismissed." "There's more, Captain," Mitchell continued. "The digital recorder you mentioned, we've reviewed the audio. Every communication between you and Tower Command is documented, including some interesting conversations." He pressed play on a small device. Reese's voice came through clearly. "Tower, visual confirms pattern movement inconsistent with scheduled drills. Then Mallory's response. "Observer, we show full green on external teams. Zone 7 is cleared for exercise. But there was something else in the background, another voice, fainter, speaking to someone off radio. Keep her talking. Make sure she logs everything." Torres and Mitchell exchanged glances. "Sergeant Martinez," Captain Mitchell said quietly, "did you know Lieutenant Mallory was under investigation by base security?" Reese felt the air shift in the room. "No, sir. She's been suspected of selling intelligence to external parties. Training schedules, security protocols, patrol routes. We've been building a case for months, but we needed evidence of active sabotage." Torres opened another folder. "Your documentation provides that evidence. The dismissed warnings, the failure to respond to confirmed threats, the deliberate positioning of personnel away from vulnerable areas, it all fits. What we couldn't figure out," Captain Mitchell continued, "was how she planned to cover up a successful breach, until now." The Z. Pieces clicked into place in Reese's mind. She needed someone to blame. "The observer with attitude problems," Torres confirmed grimly. "The troublemaker who sees threats that aren't there. If the attack had succeeded, your reports would have been evidence of system failure, not sabotage. You'd have been the scapegoat who missed the real threat because you were crying wolf about mirages." "But you didn't miss anything," Captain Mitchell said. "Your shot stopped the breach and preserved the evidence. The equipment we recovered from the site confirms foreign intelligence gathering operations." Reese sat back in a chair, processing the implications. "How long have you known? About Mallory? Months? About you?" Torres smiled grimly. "About 20 minutes after we reviewed your files and realized that the attitude problems in your Record all stemmed from questioning superior officers who were later disciplined or investigated themselves. He pulled out another document, her original service record, complete and unredacted. 3 confirmed kills in Afghanistan. Expert marksman rating. 2 commendations for precision under pressure. And a complaint filed against Major Bradley for endangering troops through negligent command decisions. Torres looked up. Bradley was court-martialed 6 months after you were transferred out. Turns out you were right about him too. The wait of 8 months at Ridge Base, the isolation, the dismissal, the constant questioning of her own judgment suddenly felt different. Not lighter, but repositioned somehow, like a pack that had been sitting wrong finally settling into place. "What happens now?" she asked. Captain Mitchell closed his folder. "Now you help us finish the investigation. Mallory doesn't know we have your recordings yet. We need her to incriminate herself further before we move. You want me to continue as observer? We want you to be exactly what you've always been," Torres said. "A soldier who sees what others miss and has the courage to act on it." He paused, studying her face. "But this time, you won't be alone. And this time, we'll be listening." For the first time in months, Reese felt something she'd almost forgotten. The satisfaction of being exactly where she belonged, doing exactly what she was trained to do. The system hadn't failed her. It had been sabotaged, and now she was going to help set it right. 3 days after the shooting, Ridge Base hummed with a different kind of tension. On the surface, everything looked normal. Training exercises continued. Equipment was maintained. Personnel followed their usual routines. But underneath, a careful operation was taking shape. Reese had been officially cleared of any wrongdoing. In the shooting, though, the paperwork would take weeks to finalize. More importantly, she'd been quietly reassigned to expanded observation duties that gave her access to areas of the base she'd never seen before. Captain Mitchell had been clever about it. Instead of suddenly changing her status, he'd made it look like a bureaucratic expansion of her existing role. New forms to fill out, additional equipment to monitor, more comprehensive reports to file. What it really meant was that Reese now had eyes and ears throughout the base, documenting patterns that only someone with her training would recognize. And Lieutenant Mallory was getting nervous. "Martinez." Mallory approached her position near the communications array that morning, trying to project her usual authority, but failing to hide the tightness around her eyes. "I need to review your incident report from Tuesday." "Yes, ma'am. I filed it through proper channels yesterday. I need to see it before it goes up the chain. There may be details that need clarification." Reese kept her expression neutral. "Which details, ma'am?" "Your timeline, the sequence of communications, some of the technical specifications." Mallory paused, watching Reese's face. "There's concern that certain elements might be misinterpreted by personnel who weren't present." Translation: she wanted to edit Reese's report to match whatever story she'd been preparing. "I documented everything accurately, ma'am. Captain Mitchell has already reviewed the materials." Something flickered in Mallory's expression. Anger made he fear. Captain Mitchell wasn't on the range. He doesn't understand the operational complexities of the situation. Neither did Tower Command, apparently. The words hung in the air between them. Mallory's face went very still. "Sergeant Martinez, I think you need to be very careful about the accusations you're implying." "I'm not implying anything, ma'am. I'm stating facts. I observed hostile movement, reported it through proper channels, and was told to disregard what I was seeing. The evidence speaks for itself." Mallory stepped closer, lowering her voice. "The evidence can be interpreted in many ways. Your record hasn't always been reliable. Major Bradley's concerns about your judgment were well documented." "Major Bradley was court-martialed for negligent command," Reese replied evenly. That's not relevant to..." "It's very relevant, ma'am." because it establishes a pattern of my superior officers being more concerned with politics than security. Mallory's composure finally cracked. You need to be very careful, Sergeant. Very careful about the enemies you make and the bridges you burn. This base is smaller than you think, and memories are long. Is that a threat, ma'am? It's advice. From someone who understands how the system works. But Reese could see that Mallory was the one who didn't understand how the system worked. Not anymore. Because while they'd been talking, Reese's new equipment had been recording every word. After Mallory left, Torres appeared from behind the communication shed where he'd been listening through an earpiece. She's scared, he said simply. Scared enough to make mistakes? Let's find out. The next phase of the plan was elegant in its simplicity. Reese would continue her expanded observations, but now she'd start finding patterns that suggested additional security vulnerabilities, problems that someone inside would need to address quickly to prevent exposure. If Mallory was working with outside parties, she'd have to contact them to warn about increased scrutiny. And when she did, they'd be listening. Captain Mitchell had worked with military intelligence to set up monitoring on all base communications, phones, computers, radio, frequencies, even personal devices. It was a massive operation that they had authorization from the highest levels. The trap was elegant. Give Mallory information she'd have to pass along, then catch her in the act. Over the next 2 days, Reese discovered concerning patterns. During her observations, supply shipments arriving off schedule, personnel accessing areas outside their clearance levels, communication equipment being tested during non-standard hours. None of it was real, but all of it was documented with the same meticulous care Reese brought to everything else. To an outside observer, it would look like Ridge Base was conducting a comprehensive security review. To someone selling secrets, it would look like the walls were closing in. On Thursday morning, Reese was positioned near the motor pool when she saw Mallory walking quickly toward the administration building, a personal cell phone pressed to her ear. The conversation was brief, tense, and ended with Mallory looking around nervously before heading inside. 30 minutes later, Torres found Reese at her observation post. "We got her," he said quietly. "Phone call to a number we've been watching for months. She told them to abort any planned operations because the Martinez situation has compromised security protocols. What happens now? Now we find out how deep this goes and who else is involved." But as Torres walked away, Reese felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert wind. Mallory wasn't just scared, she was desperate. And desperate people made dangerous decisions. She checked her equipment one more time and settled in for what she suspected would be a very long day. The call came at 0347 hours Friday morning, waking Reese from the kind of light sleep that soldiers learn in the field, deep enough to rest, shallow enough to respond instantly to danger. "Martinez, we need you at the command building, now." Torres's voice carried an urgency that had her boots on and weapons secured before she was fully awake. The base was quiet in that pre-dawn way that felt heavier than normal darkness, as if the air itself was holding its breath. The command building blazed with activity. Personnel moved with controlled urgency through corridors that were usually empty at this hour. Captain Mitchell met her at the entrance, his expression grim. "Lieutenant Mallory is gone," he said without preamble, along with 3 enlisted personnel and approximately 40 pounds of classified materials. Reese felt the world tilt slightly. When? Sometime between 0200 and 0300 hours. They disabled the perimeter sensors in Sector 4 and went out through the maintenance access road. Torres appeared beside them, holding a tablet displaying security footage. But that's not the worst part. Look at this. The footage showed Mallory and 3 other figures moving through the communications building. They weren't just fleeing, they or systematically destroying equipment, pulling hard drives, taking anything that might contain evidence of their activities. She's trying to erase the trail, Mitchell said. But she made one mistake. He led them to the operations center, where a bank of monitors showed various angles of the base. On the central screen, a map displayed tracking signals, 4 small dots moving steadily northeast toward the state highway. She didn't know about the new transponder system in the vehicles, Torres explained. Every base vehicle now has tracking. That can't be disabled without specialized equipment. How far ahead are they? Reese asked. 40 minutes, maybe less. State police have units moving to intercept, but the terrain gives them multiple escape routes. Captain Mitchell turned to Reese. Sergeant Martinez, I'm about to ask something that goes well beyond your duties as an observer. Yes, sir? You know this terrain better than anyone on base. You've been mapping wind patterns, elevation changes, sight lines for months. If they're trying to reach an extraction point, where would they go? Reese closed her eyes, picturing the hundreds of charts she'd created, the wind patterns she'd tracked, the geographic features she'd noted in meticulous detail. The desert around Ridge Base was deceptive. What looked like open terrain was actually cut by dozens of arroyos, hidden valleys, and elevated positions that could hide vehicles from aerial observation. The old mining road, she said suddenly, 23 kilometers northeast. It's below the main sight lines, has multiple access points, and connects to 3 different highway systems. That's not on any of our current maps, Mitchell said. No, sir. I found it while tracking wind patterns through the northeast valleys. It's partially washed out, but still passable by vehicles. Torres was already coordinating with the state police units. If they're heading there, we can cut them off at the highway junction. But Reese was studying the map more carefully, remembering something else. Captain, there's a problem. The mining road has elevated positions that provide clear fields of fire back toward the base. If they reach those positions, she didn't need to finish. Everyone in the room understood. Mallory had intimate knowledge of base security protocols, personnel schedules, and defensive capabilities. From an elevated position with the right equipment, she could do enormous damage. How long do we have? Mitchell asked. If they maintain current speed, maybe 20 minutes before they reach the high ground. The room fell silent, except for the hum of electronics and the distant sound of helicopters spinning up outside. Mitchell looked at Torres, then at Reese. Sergeant Martinez, there's a helicopter crew prepping for pursuit. They need someone who knows the terrain well enough to guide them to the intercept point. I volunteer, sir. This isn't observation. Duty, Sergeant. This is active pursuit of armed suspects who have already shown they're willing to compromise base security. Reese met his eyes steadily. Sir, for 8 months I've been watching this base, learning every detail of its operations, documenting patterns that others missed. Lieutenant Mallory used that against us, but now it's our advantage. She paused, thinking of all the dismissed reports, all the times her expertise had been ignored. She knows our defensive capabilities, but I know this terrain better than she does. And unlike her, I'm not running scared. Torres nodded approvingly. She's right, Captain. And she's already proven she can handle pressure. Mitchell studied Reese for a long moment. Then he reached into his desk and pulled out something she hadn't seen in months. Her original service record, complete with marksman ratings and combat commendations. Sergeant Martinez, you are hereby authorized for active pursuit duty, full equipment access, direct command authority for terrain guidance. As they headed toward the helicopter pad, Torres fell into step beside her. Martinez, he said quietly, I want you to know after this is over, you're not going back to observer duty. Sir, the base is recommending you for promotion and transfer to tactical intelligence. Turns out we need more people who see what others miss. The helicopter's rotors were already turning as they approached. Through the growing dawn light, Reese could see the desert stretching out ahead, the same landscape she'd been mapping and studying for months, now about to become a battlefield. But this time, she wouldn't be watching from the sidelines. This time, she would be leading the charge. The helicopter lifted off just as the first light began to paint the eastern mountains gold. Below them, the desert spread out in familiar patterns, the same ridges and valleys Reese had been charting for months, now seen from a completely different perspective. "There," Reese called over the rotor noise, pointing to a dust cloud moving along what looked like empty terrain. "They're following the old mining road, just like I predicted." The pilot, Chief Warrant Officer Davis, banked toward the intercept course. Behind them, a second helicopter carried a tactical team led by Torres. State police units were converging from the highway, but Reese knew the timing would be critical. "How far to the elevated positions?" Davis asked through the headset. 3 kilometers. Once they reach that ridge line, they'll have clear sight back to the base and multiple escape routes. Below them, the 4 dots that represented Mallory's vehicles were moving faster now, kicking up larger dust clouds. They knew they were being pursued. "Contact ahead," came Torres's voice through the radio. 4 vehicles, military pattern, approaching target zone. Reese studied the terrain through binoculars. The mining road curved up through a narrow canyon before emerging onto the high plateau. If they could block the exit. "Chief Davis, can you put us down on the plateau before they reach it?" "Negative. Too many unknowns about their firepower. But I can give you a good angle for observation. That's all I need." They crested the ridge just as Mallory's convoy reached the canyon entrance. From this height, Reese could see everything: the vehicles, the personnel, even the equipment they were carrying. "Torres, this is Martinez. I count 4 individuals. Multiple weapon cases and what looks like communications gear. They're setting up some kind of transmission equipment. Can you identify targets?" Reese adjusted her scope, using the same methodical approach she'd applied to wind observation for months. Confirmed visual on Lieutenant Mallory. "She's directing setup of what appears to be satellite communication gear." Suddenly, the radio crackled with a new voice, official, authoritative. "This is Colonel Adams, Base Command. All units, be advised we have authorization for immediate apprehension. Suspects are considered armed and dangerous." The pieces clicked into place. This wasn't just about selling secrets. They were planning to transmit critical intelligence in real time. Base locations, security protocols, personnel information. Everything Mallory had access to over the past year. "Chief, can you get us closer to that plateau?" "Working on it." But they've got high ground advantage now. Through her scope, Reese watched Mallory's team complete their setup. In minutes, they'd be transmitting classified information that could compromise not just Ridge Base, but every installation Mallory had knowledge of. That's when she saw something that changed everything. One of the men with Mallory was adjusting what looked like a rocket-propelled grenade launcher, aimed not at the pursuing forces, but back toward Ridge Base itself. They weren't just planning to escape. They were planning to destroy evidence and eliminate witnesses. "All units, this is Martinez. They have RPG capability and are targeting the base. Recommend immediate intervention." Torres's voice came back tense. "Martinez, we're still 2 minutes out. Can you maintain visual?" Reese looked at the distance, calculated wind patterns she'd been studying for months, considered the angle and the stakes. "Negative on maintaining. Visual only." She turned to Chief Davis. "Chief, I need you to put me down on that ridge." "Sergeant, that's not the mission. The mission just changed. They're about to destroy evidence and potentially kill base personnel. I can stop the transmission and neutralize the RPG threat. Davis looked at her for a long moment, seeing something in her expression that reminded him why she'd been the one person who saw the original threat coming. "Roger, putting you down in 30 seconds. The helicopter touched down just long enough for Reese to jump out with her rifle and equipment. As it lifted away, she was alone on the ridge, 400 meters from Mallory's position, with the sun rising behind her and the fate of the base in her hands. She set up quickly, using every technique she'd perfected during months of observation. Wind speed, elevation compensation, target movement patterns, all the skills that had been dismissed and undervalued were now critical. Through her scope, she could see Mallory frantically working at the communication equipment while one of her accomplices prepared the RPG launcher. Reese took a breath, held it, and made the shot that ended the transmission before it could begin. Then she shifted targets and stopped the RPG threat with a second shot that echoed across the desert like thunder. By the time Torres's team reached the plateau, it was over. The remaining 2 suspects surrendered without resistance, surrounded by evidence of their planned sabotage. Lieutenant Mallory was found unconscious but alive, her equipment destroyed. Her intelligence operation ended before it could compromise a single additional life. As the sun climbed higher, Reese stood on the ridge overlooking the scene, finally understanding what Torres had meant days earlier. She wasn't just an observer who had prevented an attack. She was a soldier who had fought for her base, her mission, and her country in the most fundamental way possible, by seeing clearly, acting decisively, and refusing to back down when the system failed. 3 weeks later, Sergeant First Class Rebecca Martinez received her promotion and transfer orders to Tactical Intelligence. Her new assignment: training observation, specialists to recognize and respond to threats that traditional systems might miss. Her first class would include a comprehensive case study titled "The Ridge Base Incident: How One Observer's Vigilance Prevented a Catastrophic Security Breach." But more importantly, it would include something the military had been missing for too long: a recognition that the person watching from the outside sometimes sees threats that those inside cannot or will not acknowledge. The truth had a way of surfacing, Reese learned, sometimes quietly, through meticulous documentation and patient observation, and sometimes, when necessary, with the crack of a rifle shot across the desert dawn. As she packed her final charts and equipment from Ridge Base, Reese found herself thinking about the wind patterns she'd mapped so carefully. They were still there, still shifting and changing with the seasons and the weather. But now someone else would be watching them. Someone who understood that observation wasn't just about recording data. It was about protecting the people who counted on you to see what they couldn't. The desert wind picked up one last time as she walked toward the transport vehicle, carrying with it the scent of sage and the promise of new challenges ahead. She was no longer just an observer. She was exactly what she'd always been: a soldier who protected others by refusing to look away from the truth, no matter how inconvenient it might be for those in power. And that, Reese knew, was the most important victory of all. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.